So welcome to the October Auckland Game Dev Meetup, where I'm joined by Carl Leducq, producer and host of Zero to Play, and Philip, managing director of Mighty Kingdom. And we're going to be talking about the world-leading IPs on our side of the hemisphere. So, Carl, let's start again with this, shall we?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Josh. And thanks for having me here. And thanks, Philip, for being the brains behind this conversation. I'm really excited to have a chat to you and get into IP. So the first question that I want to ask is kind of the definition of IP, because I think that will get the conversation, get everyone kind of on the same page with terms and things like that. So what is IP? What is intellectual property? And how can you explain that and give a few examples of what that is in your mind?
Yeah, sure thing. And this will be the second time we've done it. Hopefully it's as good the second time around. But if you're wondering why I was holding up my mug before, I was talking about the difference between, everyone can conceptually understand physical property, right? Like, and the mug here, as I was holding up, is a physical object. It's my mug. I own it. And if somebody else wants that mug, they need to pay me money to buy it off me. And intellectual property is similar, except that it's not tied to a physical good. And so it can be anything from a concept or an idea. In our industry, typically like a game design or a game mechanic can be considered intellectual property. But when we talk about Star Wars, for instance, as a brand or as an IP, what we are talking really about is the brand identity, the characters, the worlds, the stories that are created, the visual iconography of that, the lightsabers, whatnot. That's all part of that IP. The interesting thing for us is that when you're creating a game, you're also creating technical IP. You're creating the technology that underpins a product and allows that to be represented on the screen. And that's a different kind of IP as well. So oftentimes when we're talking about creating products at Mighty Kingdom, we look at whether the IP is wholly original in terms of brand, or is it technology, or some combination of both. And so it can get a little bit blurry. But I like to think of it as when you're using a brand like Star Wars, everything that's visual is the brand, and that's the brand identity, and everything that's technical behind the scenes is your technology and the underpinning. And if you think about those two groups of IP, you can start to see how you can sort of mix and match that together to create original products or licensed products.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so one kind of mission that I have for this conversation that I hope we get to in the end is having people in the Australasian market feel a bit more confident, because I feel like a lot of the IPs that people talk about that are the most well known are American and very much based in that area. And I would love to, so that's one of the missions I have, is to make people feel more confident in this kind of area, that they can create things that can be as strong, or maybe not necessarily as strong as Disney, but still successful. Do you have a few examples from the Southern Hemisphere of IP that you really admire, or people that are doing a really successful job of kind of building that brand?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot, right? And you look at Path of Exile, you look at Ashen, you look at what you guys are doing with at Rocketworks with Icarus. I look at those and I think those are sort of very what I think of as traditional games. Like when people think of the game industry, they think of that sort of, they're quite hardcore, I guess. They aim at a sort of segment of the audience that has grown up playing games, is quite used to the big controllers, looking for that complexity and that competitiveness. But I think as well in New Zealand, you're seeing some really interesting IP being generated outside that space. Like you look at what Dinosaur Polo is doing with Mini Metro, right? Mm-hmm. Now that is a real. You could just look at a screenshot and go, "Oh, that's from Mini Metro or Mini Motorways." Like they've established this style and this brand and this type of gameplay, and they're seeing a lot of success from it. And another one that's a bit more closer to my heart is the Ninja Kiwi guys with balloons, right? They've managed to dress up quite a hardcore sort of strategy game, but with monkeys and balloons and all these sorts of things. And it just shows that there are many different pathways to find success in this industry. And I think that's what's exciting, is that you asked about the US market and our focus on that market. And it is one of the largest markets. But there are just as many billion-dollar games coming out of Japan or Korea, or increasingly in Southeast Asia. And when you talk to some of the big platforms, they're talking about the next billion users, right? We've already seen the explosion of growth in China, or what's next. And they're looking at places like the India subcontinent and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and thinking of what games do they want to play. And we're even seeing within the traditional Western markets, a maturing of the market as well, where people are now looking for what's next, right? They can get enough. They can get another Call of Duty or a Battlefield or a shooter. Like there's plenty of those options, but if you want something else, what is there? And you're seeing them look for look in places where you probably wouldn't have looked in the past. They're demanding a bit more representation and diversity on the screen. They're looking for authenticity and uniqueness of storytelling. And this is where I think in New Zealand and here in Australia as well, we have a really great opportunity, right? Our stories haven't really been told on a grand scale on that stage yet. And I said at a talk a while ago, if everyone's takeaway from our culture is Moana, then that's not a good. We don't want to. That's a great start, but I don't want that shouldn't be where it ends, right? I looked at that and saw the success of that was proof that there's an audience and an appetite for stories that are uniquely South Pacific, right? And I'd love to see a wave of products and IP that comes out that speaks that authentic voice and uses what's unique about us, New Zealand and sees that on screen. And we're seeing the number of people playing games worldwide just grows and grows and grows, and that just means that those niches of people who are looking for that content are actually millions of people, right? So you can have these massive successes within the space. So yeah, I think this is the right time to be creating original products, creating original IP, particularly as you're seeing. So if you want to jump in, I'm just going on a tear. But you're seeing all the platforms are really getting into like streaming and subscription and all these sorts of things, right? And it's leading this massive drive of consolidation and acquisition in our space. But what they're looking for is content. They're looking for games to play. They're looking for things that you can only get, things that stand out as being unique on their platforms. So,
yeah. No, I think like talking about culture is definitely really important, and you're right. There's a great opportunity for us to tell local stories. I have a few more questions about that, but just something before I forget that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned like looking at a screenshot of Mini Metro and how easily you're able to recognize that as like a brand and an IP. Like what other ways do you feel give you the sense that it is a strong IP? Like what is it that makes you think, oh, this is a great IP? Like just in terms of the kind of like things that you, like the reactors that you have in your mind as to how you can tell something apart.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? Because it's not like it's a checklist, and if you just do these 12 things, then you're going to have a world-beating IP.
Damn, that's what I was after.
Yeah, you're after the checklist. Damn it. So I think that there's a certain amount of luck and timing involved in any sort of breakout, right? And you often see very similar products come along, and one takes off and another doesn't, and sometimes you wonder why, and you can get lost in that wondering, right? But there are certain things that we know underpin every successful product, and that's having a consistency, making sure that the artwork and the theming is consistent through across a product, so that the design language that you choose, whatever that may be, has internal consistency and internal logic. I look for things personally that have depth. Like if it's a sort of world that only one story can be told, then it doesn't really facilitate a whole brand. It's really just telling like a little piece. So I like to look for things that can allow the world to expand and grow over time. Oftentimes we find, like when we're developing our stories internally, sometimes it's about what you don't put on the screen. It's all the work that you do behind the scenes to help understand why the world is the way it is, or why the characters behave the way they do. And that can allow those unique voices to come through in the characters and in the world. So you don't actually have to sit there and explain, oh, this tree is planted by my grandfather 24 years ago, or whatever. Like you can just have the character interact with it in a way that's organic and natural. It's one of those things, right? It's easy to spot it when it works, but it's hard to understand when it doesn't. Why did Star Wars take off and like something like Barbarella? I mean, let's not go there, but why did that, of all the sci-fi franchises, why did that one break out? And it's got some good themes in there, right? You got to find ways for people to get into your brand. There's all these different ways of doing it, about creating an avatar within that world that is the player, sort of learning that journey, etc. Finding ways for your audience to get into it. And I often find that the best IPs are ones that they're not so far ahead of everyone that you just have you can't attach yourself to any of it. They're ones that build on themes and things that you understand, but take it further and ask interesting questions and push you forward. But yeah, on the visual side, that's, again, easy to spot it when you see it. Like you look at Pokemon, you go, that's Pokemon, right? But there are 1,000 shows that look like Pokemon, right? But why do we stick to that one? But yeah, and it gets harder and harder to create a unique visual language. You guys have done it on Icarus, right? Like how did you attack that internally?
Well, that's a really good question. Things like the branding were done before I even started working there over a year ago. But in terms of like I don't know, for me, the music is really key when I hear like the work that the audio team has done at like, I don't know, I just feel like music does a really good job of carrying that emotion and makes you think, maybe I'm just more like triggered by audio when it comes to other like senses, but I just feel like the audio does a great job of they've kind of found a little pocket of like sound that is relatable but at the same time unique, which is another great area.
Not just how it looks, but how it sounds as well can be, and I think it's all about that hook, right? Like I don't know if you've ever sort of looked into the Horizon Zero Dawn development, but that started with a piece of concept art, right? With the robots in the world, and it was that piece that everyone sort of coalesced around and were like, okay, I can see that game, and then it just triggers all these thoughts, right? Like we went through an experiment. So we're creating a game, as you know, we're creating many games, but one in particular, original one, it's a multiplayer racing game, and we struggled for a while to figure out exactly what it looked like. And we went through, you do this art exploration as you do, you get the artists to try different things. But there was one piece of artwork that came up and everyone went, oh, that's it. Like once you see it, you know that like your mind goes off with all the possibilities of where it could go and how to expand it. And whether that's a piece of artwork or whether that's a piece of game design or a piece of sound or a piece of audio, you find that hook, find that key, and all the other pieces sort of build around it and wrap around it. And as long as they're all supporting it and lifting it up and not muddying it and messing it up, then you're onto a winner, I think.
Yeah, there's definitely a conversation we could have about how teams develop an IP, like how everyone comes together with a vision, building that team like morale and just how everyone works together, because everyone from different teams has to be sold that vision as well. They want to interpretation. Do you have any advice for people developing their own IP, how to kind of have that common vision, whether it's like certain types of documentation that like outline the key like principles of the game or the IP? Do you have any kind of routines like that you make sure you do?
Yeah, for sure. I'm not a massive one for documentation, so I'm not gonna bang that drum too loudly. But yeah, no, it's a process, right? I think it's a really interesting process as well, because often that first step is it's like 100% ego, right? Like you're like, I have this idea, this is my baby, I've been thinking about this is how it works, this is how all the pieces fit together, and you're kind of putting yourself out there, right? But then from that moment, it's like everyone else takes that away, and now it's everyone's project, right? That's everyone's idea, and then it becomes, in essence, like a meritocracy. Like the good ideas stay, the bad ideas fall away. So you need to get really good at having conversations about the idea that aren't about the person, if that makes sense. You got to make sure that you're all comfortable talking about the merits of an idea, not without getting into that personal. I think that sucks, and I think you suck, and therefore everything sucks. It's like you just end up in shouting matches at that point. So it's a real delicate one, because you need to have the ego to come up with the idea, but you need to have the id and the rest of it to then be able to take on the feedback and iterate on it. And like there's no, even if you talk about going back to that Horizon Zero Dawn example where they had the piece of concept art, it was still like a 2.5 year or 3 year journey from that point, right, to actually getting a product. And along that way, you try all sorts of different things. Some work, some don't. You got to have a good process for iteration and being able to. I always say, like a good thing to keep in mind is bias towards action, bias towards doing something. Right, you can talk about an idea forever, and it's always great on paper, like 100%. Everything works in theory, right? But it's not until you actually put it in practice and you try something that you actually get to see whether it works or not. So I'd say as a general principle, we try and just do stuff and see if it works and measure it, and be comfortable enough to have that conversation to say, look, I know we all love this, but it's not working. We've got to try something else. So kill your darlings. That's the old saying, but it's very true, because you get stuck on something. You really want it to work because you love it, and all the research comes back, and you're putting it in front of playtesters, and they're going, "This sucks," and you're like, "Oh well," And the thing I always try and tell people as well is, you will make other games. You don't have to put everything into this one, right? If you have a really great idea and it just doesn't fit here, that's fine. It's still a good idea. Just put it over there. And once we get this one done and out the door, then we can come back and revisit some of those other ideas that didn't make the mix. Because I feel like a lot of times people think, this is my shot, right? I've had all this bubbling up inside me and I got to get it all out, and sometimes that can make it, you just end up with this big grab bag of all the things. You heard all the stories of student projects with their genre bending MMO, but world building, this and that. It's like we've all been there. We've all been through that that cycle. You just got to start trim away to that very, very core of your product and then build back up and around it, right? That's
I'm glad you mentioned ego. I feel like that's a big part of this, but ego when it comes to the person that came up with the idea, but then I feel like ego also becomes part of the development studio when they push something out to the world. And one question I'd love to ask, which is kind of the other extreme, what happens once you have a product that's out there and the community kind of cause friction against that ego of the vision of what the studio have. For example, something that came to mind was Marvel with Spider-Man, and there's been huge headlines and drama this year about if they're going to bring all 3 Spider-Man back from the last 3 iterations in their one metaverse movie. And I don't think it's been confirmed whether they will all be in it or not, but I feel like if it wasn't for the community kind of rallying behind that, it wouldn't have gone to this stage. And I guess my question is, how do you deal with that community push for wanting to take over what you thought the brand was and have them kind of take it in their own direction?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And we've done a lot of work in kids games, and they're funny because kids give you very direct and very clear feedback and they really want you to do very particular things with their favorite characters. But at the end of the day, it's your brand and it's your decision on what you do. Well, what I would say is, the way to successfully create those products internally is to have some really good guidelines and rules around how you communicate, what is respectful communication, what is tolerated and what isn't, right? And that's how you can facilitate that discussion internally. And you should hold your community to the same standards, right? You should set up some rules and some boundaries about what you will and won't do. There's for every example of communities having terrible ideas, there's ones of them having great ideas, right? So you need to be able to find a way to get the good stuff to bubble up without being drowned out by all the bad stuff. And I think that comes down to effective community management, and that oftentimes comes down to rules, right? And no one loves rules. We like to be pretty loose, but you need to set up those boundaries for your community early on to see what is acceptable and what isn't. At the end of the day, though, the internet is the internet. People just are going to say what they say. In my experience, it's usually a very vocal minority who sort of try and charge up and amp up their concerns over and above everyone else. So it is about getting some perspective, right? We talk a lot about data, right? When we talk about iterating, it's about trying something, measuring the results, and then making a decision based on that, right? And you can do the same thing with your community. Okay, there has been this feedback. How many people are doing this? You've got tools, right? You can poll, you can survey, you can do these things, and actually gauge some interest in how wide-reaching is this conspiracy, or is it just a few loud people, a few dedicated people? At the same time, you want to make sure your super fans are engaged and empowered, but yeah, so that's why we hire community managers and let them sort that out. Totally. That's because they're very good at it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Going back to what we were talking about, culture, I feel like there's a ton of value that we can extract from this. Just for context, are you familiar with Umurangi Generation and the project that won the Seamus McNally Prize at IGF this year?
I must confess that I have not.
No, that's all good. So it's an indie game made by Naftali Faulkner, who's based in Australia, but he's originally from New Zealand, and he kind of incorporated culture into that game as the narrative of the story. And I thought it was a really cool project because it kind of innovates on the photography game genre.
Yes, no, this does ring a bell now, yeah.
And so, for me, that's the most recent example of just and the art style is very kind of unique and easily recognizable. But it's an example of a successful indie title that's kind of made an impact overseas. And I feel like when we talk about culture, you can very easily go to the other extreme where you start to prioritize telling the story of culture rather than like the fun of the game and focusing on the game design. So
if you want to deliver a message, a game is a very expensive way to deliver a message. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, but there's a big trend of, people, whether it's creating serious games, but even just kind of trying to tell stories in their hometown. Like, what advice do you have for that balance of how much they should lean into their culture and their stories in their kind of work, and how much they should listen to what the trends are in the market at the moment? Like, do you have any kind of indicators for what's a good balance?
Yeah, I mean, you do need to be cognizant of what the trends are, right? Because you want to, at the end of the day, you're creating a product that is meant to entertain people, I suspect. So, like you say, there are serious games. There's a very broad spectrum of what a game can be these days. But usually you're looking to create a product for commercial gain, right? You want to be able to make some revenue from this product so you can then do it again. You can make another one and follow it up. So in that sense, there's usually some form of entertainment or some sort of, what am I trying to say? Like a people have to derive some sort of value from the product that you're creating, so that they can assign a dollar value to it and pay you for that, and then you can make some money and do it again. So you kind of need to know what the market's doing, what people are doing, and what's working and what's not. And sometimes we do it in a way of, like, a game takes 2 years to make, right? So some of them longer. And so you want to look at change over time, and you'll find that some genres peak and fall, and then peak and fall, and some are evergreen. And so you want to think, how best can I communicate my story? What other competitors are telling the same or similar stories in a similar way? How can I find areas to innovate within that? So that's always a good way. It's just a thing that you should do whenever you're looking at any sort of commercial investment, right? Whether that's direct money investment from yourself or your time investment. But yeah, when it comes to culture, I think everyone thinks it needs to be like, when you think of New Zealand, you think of the Māori culture, right? And you think that's what it has to be. But the way I think about it is, we're so saturated by seeing the world through a very particular lens and through a very particular value system, right? Which is the American, Western educated. I can't remember how the whole weird acronym goes, but we're used to seeing things through this very particular lens. Like, I don't know if you saw on Game Pass recently, a game called Malacca came up, which is it's indigenous Mexican history thing, and it's like, visually it's like unlike anything you've seen, because it's based on their interpretation of the spirit world and etc. And it's like, okay, cool, this is something I could never have seen before. But it's a third-person action game, right? It's using the language and using the genre that we're familiar with to give us that attachment into it, but then it's telling a story that is seeing the world through a completely different and unique perspective. And I think we forget, like, down in New Zealand and here in Australia, that we have these cultures that see the world differently to the way everyone else does. And we often try to articulate that culture through our Western lens, but really we should be leaning into just embracing that perspective of the world, the perspectives of right versus wrong, good versus evil, whatever, right? Like, there's a lot of ways that has been expressed. We're just so used to the Western fairy tale version of it, that we forget that there are 1,000 other ways to tell these stories. And, I think as well, like, you look at the success that, Taika Waititi has had recently, and my kids were watching Boy the other day, and you're like, man, that's just such a uniquely New Zealand story. And it's the language, it's the setting, it's just the themes, and about how the characters communicate and interact with each other. It's like, it's still a movie, and it's still on the screen, and it still has a first, second and third act, and it still resolves nicely at the end. But so it's using that language of film, but telling a story that's a very particular way. Like, film does this really well, right? You see it a lot. Games are getting there, and it's about thinking about, it's not just always good, bad, bad guy, hit him on the head with a stick. There's a lot of ways, a lot of nuance that you can tell, that you can dig into. Yeah,
it's we're talking about film. It's interesting because for games, I mean, in New Zealand, I know the stats is 96% in export. Like, all the income comes from 96% exports. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but I just feel like if you have a game that is commercially successful, it's unlikely that you have like a commercially successful game in New Zealand. Especially like a game that's taken several years to develop. You're targeting bigger markets than just a country. I'm curious about the stats of Boy and how successful that was overseas.
Well, I got 2 watches here in Australia.
There you go. Yeah, but that is interesting because, and you're right. Well, what I think is important from that like conversation is that it followed this film structure. It was taking the principles of film and what good, like how films were structured, and delivered like a story within that format. And I think
like repurposing it.
Yeah.
And I think as well, like he's even shown how you can remain true to yourself and your culture at scale, right? Like you look at what he's managed to pull off as,
Cool.
yeah, like that's just a quintessentially Kiwi character. We all know someone like that.
Yeah.
And if you've seen the latest one, Free Guy, like it's the same thing again. It's like you don't have to hide who you are. Be proud of who you are. Like that actually helps you stand out in a market. Like at the moment, you think about how many games are released to Steam or to the phones every day. How do you stand out from that crowd? By being like everyone else? No, I think you get lost in that crowd, right? You want to let your authentic voice shine through, and Tiger's shown that you can do that even within a system that's designed to make everything look the same, right? Like he's managed to have that authenticity stick through.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is interesting is you're seeing that representation in film, and it will happen in games too. You're seeing people starting to demand that the stories being told, they want to see themselves represented on screen, right? And you're seeing in what Netflix is doing and the amount of the explosion of content that they've managed to create that services all these different interest groups, right? You're seeing games start to get that demand as well. And you're starting to see that shift to a demand on the creation side as well, not just what's on the screen, but what is behind the screen. Again, Tiger is an example of who wherever he makes his films demands that half the crew are from, a local.
Oh, nice.
And you're seeing that sort of thing happen in games, right? People are saying, not just I need to see myself represented in a character on the screen, but I want people like me making games for people like me. And so it goes beyond just the stories the games that you create, but it's also the people who are creating the games as well, and encouraging more voices to get in the room. Like we're so used to, this is probably not a great representative group here, but a lot of the industry here in Australia and I think in New Zealand as well, I've spoken into GDC about it, it's still 80% male, and I would suspect most of them are white males, right? And that just means we're only hearing from a very narrow group of people, with some very narrow group of experiences, and so it's probably no surprise that the games will sort of conform to a particular view. It's when you start seeing more diverse creators behind the screen as well that you find more diverse stories and more diverse ideas get put into the mix. And then the good ones will stay and the good ones bubble up, and if you've got a good methodology for discovering them. But yeah, if you get the same people and put them in the room and say, okay, now this time do something different, they're like, well, it's tough. So it's both sides of the equation.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder, there might be a few more questions regarding like diversity that we can dig into. An interesting takeaway from that was a thought experiment that people could do is what would a game look like if Taika Waititi made a game, just having that thought, because I feel like he does really come across as someone who really cares about his culture. And like you said, he's found a way to infuse it at scale, which is really cool to see.
Yeah, I'd say on top of that as well, it's not all dour and serious and frowny. He's having fun with it, right? Don't be afraid to poke fun at yourself and enjoy it, right? Like you're here to entertain, right? So it doesn't all have to be, it doesn't all have to be super serious. I will say though, caveat that if you are thinking of doing something that is quite culturally driven, that you engage a consultant to provide that authenticity. If you're not, like, if I sit down to make a game about Indigenous Australian, culture, I'm going to have to get some people in the room, who represent that culture. Otherwise, I'm again just applying my lens onto their stories, right? So if you're aiming for that authenticity, making sure that it is represented in the, like the Ghost of Tsushima guys are a good example of that, right? Who really delved into Japanese culture and brought in consultants and experts in that space. So even though they weren't from that culture, they're able to tell an authentic story within that space. So do the work, do the hard work. And I know it's not fun, and oftentimes you have to compromise, but that's life, right? That's reality.
Yeah, totally. It's a really good piece of advice. Earlier we mentioned like trends and being on top of the market, and one question I have is, based on your experience, do you feel like there's a site, like keeping track of where the market is going. Like if I wanted to make an IP, if like that's where kind of my mindset was, how would you go about like looking at what the market is doing? Do you have any like advice or tactics for how to go out and kind of see what is getting attention and what area?
Yeah, sure thing. So I'd start with like you're I'm not talking about you specifically, but it's unlikely that your idea is 100% wholly unique, original, that no one's ever done anything ever like it before in the world. Because if you have, I mean, you're a genius and you found a niche that doesn't exist, like making subway maps, for instance, or but more likely but even then, that's a puzzle game at its core, right? So even though you won't find a game that's exactly like yours, you can go, okay, let's take a step back. What genre is it like? And we always like to start with who's our audience? Who is this game for? Like, who are the people who are going to play this? And we think about player personas in terms of like motivations. Like are they explorers? Are they fighters? Or, you come up with these ways of describing who your audience is, and then that lets you go, okay, what other games service that need, right? What are the games that have the best exploration mechanics? So you can go. And you can go far back as well. You can go, okay, well, Shadow of the Colossus has this really great exploration mechanic, right? You're out there searching around and finding these colossus, and you're discovering how to climb them. You could say World of Warcraft has a great discovery mechanic. When you're out going into new zones and finding things for the first time. So you can start to pull these threads out, and you look for people who've done it well, people who've done it poorly, and you can start to find. You want to see. It's very easy when you look at genres to just see all the outliers. Like if you go, I'm going to make a construction game, they go, Minecraft. Okay, all right, fine. Let's say, we're not all going to sell 10 million copies a year, right? It's and so here more locally, people say, oh, I want to make a platforming game. They're like, oh, like Hollow Knight. And it's like, okay, there's lots of platforming games. They're not all Hollow Knight, right? Yeah. But then it's about, because that gives you an idea of what the possibility space is, right? If we create the story and if we create this product and we do it well, is there an audience for this at the end of it? Or are we painted ourselves into a corner where we've mashed too many genres together and our addressable market is this tiny thing and it's going to be really hard for us to communicate to market? Like, so that's a good place to start. Start with the outliers and then work your way back. Steam has some good charts of like the top 10 in a genre. Like the Conan guys, Funcom, they could talk quite openly about this with Conan Exiles, right? They talk about how they went on Steam, they looked at the top genres, they looked at survival, they looked at the top 10, and they noticed that it was like, I don't know, I can't remember the games, but it was like, the first one had like 5 million sales, the next one had 2 million sales, the next one had like 100,000. So they're like, okay, there's a gap. Like there should be more products here. So they created a product that hit that need. So yeah, you can find those gaps and figure out what that then comes down to like how big does our game need to be? Like how much does it have to have in it? Does it have to be a 10 or 15 hour experience? Can it be a 2-hour experience? Does it need to be a 100-hour experience? And then that'll determine how much it's going to cost you to make it, right? And that's the other thing, or how long it will take to get to market. And the other thing we do is you subscribe to all the news feeds or the things, because sometimes like you come up with a really cool idea. Like we've had some games internally that have been really looking really good, and we're prototyping some stuff. And then like 5 games get announced that are looking at the same problem and addressing it the same way. And you're like, oh man, it's like going to become an incredibly competitive space. So you need to be on top of those trends and be ready to move if you need to. But that being said, success is different for everyone, right? Like for us, I think at the intro, you mentioned that there was 130, we're actually 140 now. So there's a lot of mouths to feed. So success for us needs to look a certain way. But if you're 2 or 3 people in a doing it part-time or on the side, success can be very different for you, right? And understanding what your goals are for this as well. So you can go there and you can look at all these sort of commercial indicators for success and et cetera. But if really what you want to do is just tell a really personal story and reach just a half a dozen people around the world who feel the same thing, that's fine. Like that's okay. But know that going in so that you're not disappointed when you only find 6 people, that's your goal. That's fine. It's all about just sort of making sure you're managing your investment of your time, even if it's not money. Your time that's the one thing you don't get back, right? Like you can make more money, but it's really hard to make more time. No one's figured that out yet. But,
yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. One like interesting like IP kind of news that I've seen announced recently is the Nickelodeon AllStar Brawl, which is like a clone of Super Smash Bros.
Yeah.
And that's just fascinating because I mean the strategy behind that must have been they must have seen a gap in the market, I guess. No, like competitive
Yeah.
like games that are competing with Super Smash Bros. And taking a piece of that market. So it's really interesting to see them do that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so we've talked to a lot of these different people in different ways, but the thing I found interesting there is Super Smash Bros. Was such a unique proposition, right? Like it's just this mashup of all this different IP together, and you need to have a significant stable of IP that's different enough to be able to pull that off. And we've seen heaps of people trying to like ground up create new IP in that space, and it's just so hard because there's like when you see the different characters in Smash Bros, you can understand why they behave and attack and do the things that they do because you've got this history of them from these other products. When you're doing it from the ground up, it's just all arbitrary decisions that you're making for the sake of making it, right? So what Nickelodeon were able to do is just draw from their stable of IP and go, well, we have all these crazy characters, so we could do the same thing, but just Nickelodeon. I think that's really smart, right? They played that card pretty well. They could have played it any number of years ago. They just decided to do it now. And so look, I think that's really exciting. And like you've seen, like Sega All-Star Racing sort of trying to mimic Mario Kart. Like you'll find whenever there's a massive outlier success, you'll see people chase after them and try and mimic them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like you always have to. The hardest part about this industry is that you just have to make a great game. Like it needs to be the underlying. Like you have to do all these other things right, but you also just have to make a great game. Like no shitty game sells 100 million copies, right? Like it has to actually be good. So you can have the greatest brand, the greatest IP, the greatest technology underpinning it, but it's just not fun. It's like, oh man,
exactly.
It's pretty brutal. So it's like when you see success and you see those runaway successes, it is oftentimes like these almost like stars aligning moments. Like I think Path of Exile sort of hit at a time when people were looking for that again, like Diablos and whatnot hadn't really sort of pushed that genre forward or done anything new. And suddenly these games came that were able to offer a similar experience that people were like, okay, cool. And then like you can catch that lull between games, and then suddenly you can create these massive IP, right?
Yeah.
Look, timing is one thing that you can't control in this industry, unfortunately.
Another thing about Path of Exile is they tried a completely new business model that Diablo couldn't do. They were one of the first kind of free-to-play model games, and that was just a timing thing as well. Like they were exploring a completely new generation of monetization. So that was a huge, I think, part of their success as well. So yeah, like you were saying, there's just timing and there's all these variables, and they have to make a great game at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting when talking about like Nickelodeon and what they're doing. We're kind of calling it a success already because it's kind of caught the headlines, but I think the game's only set to release early next year. It's going to be the true test if the hardcore fan base, like the game, if it can compete with Super Smash Bros, if it can like enter into the esports circuit and survive that, and if they have all the tools to kind of keep that up, which is there needs to be a fun game in the background and not just a great IP on top.
Well, just on IP as well, just to give you an idea about how it works. When you are using someone else's IP, you pay for the privilege, right? No one gives it to you for free. So you generally pay some money up front to acquire it, and then you have to pay a royalty as you go along. So that means that like if we were to sit down at Mighty Kingdom and go, let's create something like a Nickelodeon Brawl Stars and find all this IP and mash it together, it's so cost prohibitive, right? This is what I mean by like Nickelodeon played their cards very well because they were able to leverage a stable of IP that they own. It's like everything kind of came together in a neat little package, and whether the game's good or not, let's see. But I think in some genres, in some markets as well, just existing can be enough, because if you're a parent and you're going into EV games and you're looking to buy something and you go, well, hey, my kid likes Super Smash Bros. Brawls, maybe he'll like this one. Like there are certain products that can fall into a nice little sweet spot where grandmas will buy it for the grandkids, and Nickelodeon definitely has that recognition to be able to pull that off.
Yeah, totally. That's really interesting. I'd love to talk a bit about your experience working with brands like Lego and Star Wars, and if there's any kind of insights you learned from that about how they operate as a brand that you've kind of taken away and that you take to the products that you make.
Yeah, no, definitely. One of the things I love about working with licensed partners is it gives you a template of what you should do when you're building your brand, and they often have there's like a brand manager that will sit on the other side of a relationship that you speak to. So whenever you create anything for your game, you need to get approval from them to make sure that it hits all the highs of the brand, and make sure it hits all the right notes. And so we kind of think about that concept internally, that you should have somebody whose job it is to be the owner of that, and to answer the questions like, we worked with Moose Toys to create their Shopkins games when just before that product really sort of took off. And we created this world, and we had questions like, what does a park bench look like? What does a tree look like? What does a road look like? Because they hadn't answered any of that yet. But you just have one person that you ask, and they go, it looks like this, or they say, give me 3 options. Okay, it's that one, and so that's really good because it just gives you, a one single point of truth, and it gives you that consistency that you see in the really good brands, right? Which is, they'll have their logic, they'll have their reasoning about why things are the way they are, and that's fine. Like, we just go, okay, like, don't argue too much. So I think like being able to build those structures internally is really important, to be able to have someone who's just be able to own those decisions and say what they are and what they aren't. And I guess that's the thing, right? Is they're very clear about every brand that we've worked with had a very clear idea of who their audience was, like who their customers are, and what they like and what they don't like. Like, they've been very clear about. We come up with different game ideas, right? And you put it in front of them, and they'll say, that one is too competitive. Our players like things that are more social, or at least our brand is for social play. So less of that, more of this. And you're like, that's cool. Like, being able to understand. I think a lot of times it's like a game studio or a brand is often defined by what it's not as much as what it is, right? It's all the things that you don't do. When you're in a space of infinite possibility, you need to carve it down into something that's achievable, right? And by turning off certain taps, then you can sort of focus in on the ones that are still running. And for us, we focus in on storytelling and world building as something that we really invest in, and that's something that we take as one of our core strengths. And so make sure that you've found your nugget. What's the thing that you do and that you do better than anyone else that you can focus in on? Because it's hard to do everything, right? You got to pick 1 or 2 things that you can do really well. And the best brands, they kind of, it's also like, we're looking at the successful ones, or we're missing all the failures, right? You see, well, there's plenty of IP holders that come to us asking us to make a game for them for a movie that's just about to come out. And we're like, let's just wait and see how the movie goes. And then it's just like, you never see it again. And it's like, okay, don't return those calls. But so it's about, there's whenever we look at Star Wars, you're seeing Star Wars today, which is this humongous mega brand, right? Whereas Star Wars, when it started, was just this one little thing, this little movie that was not even internally consistent. Like, they contradict themselves even in the film. So it's it's over years that they've built those layers, and they've you put people like Gary Whitta and these others in there who've added this depth and this layering to it. So now it all makes sense, and there's a consistency and a logic to it. But you forget that sometimes it starts a little bit ropey and a bit loose, right? Like, we talk about Fortnite as this great interactive multiplayer storytelling, right? Like that. How have they managed to pull this off? But look, go back to season 1. It's not that good.
Battle Royale clone.
Yeah. And they've really refined and honed in on the things that were working, and dropped all the things that weren't. And when we look at it today, we just see all the best bits, right? We forget all the missteps along the way. The Star Wars holiday specials and the whatnot.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that a bit more, about how when IP grows, it becomes more complicated yet more simple at the same time. I kind of want to touch that a bit after this next bit, because we've probably only got about 10 minutes left of our chat. But talking about licensing, I know we've called this chat building world-leading IP, but I think like having experience with licensing and working with other IPs is also really valuable to know. One question, like one thing that I see in many like Netflix shows and movies that come out is in the credits it says based upon this best-selling novel or whatever it might be, and I see that as kind of a transferring of IP from one medium to another, and I feel like I don't often see that with games these days, and but maybe like I think a lot of the kind of mobile games that are coming out, there's a lot of versions like that, but things like Lord of the Rings and what Peter Jackson did to bring Lord of the Rings to the screen, I'd love to see more experiences that come into games that are kind of built for games as a medium, these kind of big worlds. Do you think that that's a good strategy for game developers to be thinking about, is like looking at other mediums and successful titles there, and thinking about how those can be told in a game environment?
Yeah, I think that comes to a question of it's risk management is really what you're talking about there, and that's why movies are based on books, because if a book is sold 100 million copies, then the people, maybe half of that audience will turn up and watch the film, right?
Yeah.
Or at least if it's proven to work somewhere, then it's probably going to work somewhere else. The benefit that books and movies have is that they're kind of a similar storytelling medium. It's very linear. The story that you tell is the story that you tell, right? Like it's from start to finish. Everybody sees the same thing. With games, it's very different because you have an interactive element. Usually, I mean, there's lots of different types of games, but there's a player who does whatever they want, and that sometimes they can mess up your best laid plans, right? And so I think that that would lead me to look at IP through a particular lens. I'm looking for IP that allows you to tell a story within a world, as opposed to just telling one particular story, right? Because you can tell one particular story. There's a lot of really those great sort of walking simulators, or the sort of discovery games where you're just sort of putting pieces together in a story. But if you think about the big breakouts in our space, they allow the player to discover and tell their own story within a world. I think a good example of that is the Witcher series, right? That's based on a series of books, but it's really just based on a really kick-ass world, right? And they could tell a story within that world that had all the elements from the books. The Shadow of Mordor and
exactly.
they were really good as well, because you just take all the things that worked from that book and put it into, and then take all the things that make a game good and put them together, right? I think the difficulty is you have to have an IP owner that is willing to go on that journey, because often they've written a story and they've created this work because they want to say a particular thing. And if you go, hey, that's cool, we're not going to tell that story, we're going to do something else. You've got to have someone who's willing to go on that journey with you and want to do it. So if you're looking at a comic book, you're looking at something and you're thinking, man, I'd really love to make a game about that. Think about what it is in that comic book and that story that resonated with you. Like, what are the themes that you think would make a great game? And do you need that? I mean, I'm not saying steal someone's IP, but look for ways to express that in your own words, in your own products, rather than sort of borrowing someone else's. But if you come back to them and say, you know what, this is the best way to tell this story and to get this message across. But just be armed and be ready for those, like, but where's such and such a character? Oh, no, we're not doing that. We're doing this, just take them on that journey of like, this is what makes a game successful. This is why we tell a story this way. The player has agency. They want to do these certain things. They want to interact. They want to craft. We can set up this beautiful narrative, but they're just going to run over there and look behind a waterfall. You just got to make sure you take your IP owner on the journey. But effectively what they, from all the IP owners that we've interacted with, they just want to know that they can trust you to be a good steward of their brand, right? And they just don't want to they don't want to give it to you and then have something come out that's terrible, and then they're just like, oh God, what have I done, right? So then for them, this is like their work of art that they've created, and they just want to protect it and be careful with it. So just got to be conscious of that and build that trust.
I think Shadow of Mordor is a great example, because they've done incredible jobs. They've copyrighted their Nemesis system, their NPC system, and that just goes to show that there is a dedicated team of passionate game developers behind the IP. It's not just a cash grab to enter games. It's like this was a dedicated team of developers that love the genre so much, and I think it was a great combination of that. So whoever managed the Lord of the Rings IP did a good job of however that relationship came about, of finding each other.
I'm not a massive fan of patenting game technology there. It's we were talking about a game idea recently, and looking at sort of emergent storytelling and finding ways to create these moments where the stories could create themselves. And then someone was like, wait a minute, we're getting pretty close to this thing. You're like, oh man. I hate it the way that it stifles innovation, right? Because you kind of have this, you have a risk hat on. Once you get past a certain size as a business, you have to think through a risk lens, and that's, which is a bit of a shame, but it is what it is.
That's a different conversation though, because you're right. And I'm sure examples like that happened, maybe the lightsaber could have been told in different, the concept of that. I wonder the kind of lawsuits that Disney have gone through to kind of stop people from being creative.
I do like in that first episode of Futurama where he gets out the laser sword and it's just a baton that he beats him with. I was like, okay, cool. That's how you get around it. No, it's not a sword. It's like a stick. Yeah.
But the main takeaway you mentioned earlier was about how finding the world that the player can live in when it comes to getting an IP from something like a book or a film and transferring it to a game, because it's interactive, you need to have a world that's really that the player wants to live in, rather than like certain characters or actions that you really liked from the film, because that wouldn't transfer well to games as a medium. Another quick actionable piece of advice I'd love to know is if someone's wanting to reach out to an IP owner, what would that process look like, and what kind of resources or deliverables would you have to reach out to them with?
Yeah, that's a funny one, because we've been very blessed at having a lot of inbound, not a lot of outbound to have to reach out to IP owners. And it's also a difficult one, because there's the way that we did it in the past and then the way that we will do it in the future, because a lot of the stuff that we've worked on are relationships that we've built with people at conferences, where you mingle at a mixer or something, and then you swap business cards, you keep in touch, and then an opportunity comes up down the line where your skill sets match. Yeah, that's difficult now, because it's very different. But on the flip side of that, we are in a moment of time in our industry of crazy opportunity, because the amount of content that everyone is looking for to supply Game Pass and Netflix is into games now, and the industry has consolidated quite a lot. So there's just fewer places to go to get things, right? And so it's a little bit easier in a sense to actually get a deal constructed and put together, because people just are willing to sort of take a bit more of a punt, because there's a bit of FOMO, right? They don't want to miss out. So IP owners are actually a little bit more approachable now, because they're seeing successes elsewhere and they want a piece of that as well. So often, so there's a couple ways to do it. One is to get an agent, which is it can be expensive, but if you construct it the right way, then they get paid on success, and so you can kind of massage it rightly. Make sure you've got an idea of what sort of project you're looking for. Go to an agent and say, we're this company, we do these sorts of things, this is our track record, this is what we're looking for in a deal, these are the sort of brands we want to work with. And they'll go out there and they'll find that for you and bring that in. That can be really good, because it can overcome the distance issue as well, because you've got someone over there working on your behalf. Attend conferences virtually, do those matchmaking. That's actually really helpful. I know someone who had a deal done in 5 minutes by just dialing into a Slush, to a conversation at Slush, which is insane. That's probably the insane end of the spectrum. But it was one of those times when the company was like, oh, hey, we've been waiting to look, we've been following you guys. That's really awesome. Do you want to do something together? Yeah, cool. What do you got? This is it. Okay, let's do it. It's yeah, okay.
That's incredible. Yeah, virtual conferences definitely add, you're both more separated, but then more closer, if you're at the right place at the right time.
So here's a funny thing, right? A lot of those conferences have these 30-minute meetings that you queue up, and you book your whole day from 9 o'clock to 6:30 is just meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. But when you're on the conference floor, you have to walk to the next meeting. Yeah. So you actually lose 5 or 10 minutes. Honestly, one of these conference places, and the conference area is like a suburb. It's so massive. And so you actually only have 20 minutes to get your stuff out, and then you have to get off to the next one. The virtual ones, you just dial in and you're there, and that's it. And you can start talking from the start. Yeah. That is really good. But in terms of approaching IP, there's a few places as well. There's licensing expos. There's a big one in Las Vegas. So if you are looking for a tax-deductible business trip to Las Vegas, there's your opportunity. But they have them in Europe, and they have them in New York as well. But those are good places where a lot of people are in there together, right? And they're all looking to shop around IP. And that can be a good place to, oftentimes you don't make a deal at the conference, but you make the connections that lead to a deal. So they're good to attend. Or otherwise, you just LinkedIn is another good one. You often, this industry is small enough that you probably know someone who knows someone who knows the guy that you're trying to talk to. Funnily enough, Cliff Curtis lives down the road from my sister, so I'm 2 phone calls away from Tiger, which is insane, right? So once you start to understand what it is that you're looking for, you can find those connections within your own network, or even just build those bridges, right? Most people are pretty happy to connect and talk, because if you've got make sure you're coming with an actual value proposition, not just hey, I love your stuff, can we have it? You gotta come to them with a value proposition, which is this is what we do really well, this is why we think that your IP is a great fit for us, would love to talk about an opportunity. there is, like I say, there's a cost there. So you got to make sure that you can front that you've got that backing. But sometimes you get the right IP at the right time in the right way. Like with Shopkins, we were very lucky to catch it when we did, and so that was a very sort of fruitful relationship from day dot. So sometimes you get lucky, but plan on being unlucky, I guess. And then if things fall in your favor, then that's great, and run with it. But more often than not, you can end up, having to pay someone, whether it's an agent or the IP holder or everyone else in between.
Definitely. We've only got a few more minutes left. I have one more question, but that definitely sounds like realistic. And if anyone's like outside of high school, or they're an indie dev and they haven't developed any games yet, it's very unlikely that an IP owner is going to get you on board without that kind of like proof, because they care so much about their IP that they're not going to hand over money, or I think more than money, it's the IP that they don't want to hand over to someone that they can't really trust. So I think it is important to have that proven success if you are going to go out shopping for different. I
will say though, there are tiers of IP, right? Like Star Wars and Marvel and DC, they're at the top. They're at the top tier. But there's like a lot of stratas to this IP, and it's a real pyramid. Like it gets quite wide at the bottom. Like we have spoken to people who have like brands that are very popular within one country in Southeast Asia, but they have like 50 million people watching it, right? So you're like, oh, it's an interesting, and oftentimes they're so keen to get a game that they'll either share the cost or they'll give it to you for no cost. So there are lots of IPs out there, right? But like I say, just make sure you know what you're getting into, make sure you know what you're going to deliver, what the upside looks like, what success looks like, make sure that it makes sense for all parties.
Definitely. The last question I had, which is a bit, I guess, more philosophical, I don't know, but it's kind of a thread that we've been talking about throughout this chat, and it's about how IPs over time, they seem so simple. Like when you think of, we've mentioned Star Wars so many times, but like good versus evil, or like, I don't know, just different brands like Coca-Cola or McDonald's, like they're very simple, but they also we're talking about food brands, which is probably a different conversation. But when we're talking about brands like Star Wars and Marvel or Path of Exile that are incredibly complex, I feel like they're also very easy to sell and very easy to kind of latch onto. And I guess my question is, do you think it's important to think about what is the first step of an IP? Like how, like you mentioned Star Wars in the beginning, it was very inconsistent even during the film. Like I doubt that they were thinking about the scale that it is now back then. So I guess my kind of like closing question that I want to ask is like, what does that first step look like? Like what is that core feeling that you're chasing when it comes to wanting to make something new that could change the world in 10 years? Is there any, or is it or should you just not be thinking about IP at all and just follow like the craft and what you're passionate about?
I think that there's no one true path. All right. So it is about finding, we've had ideas that have sprung from just game prototypes that we made. We've had ones that have sort of sprung from like looking at the market and seeing opportunities and putting pieces together. And so there's no sort of one, like, again, there's no sort of checkbox to success. There's no escalator to success, as we like to talk about, right? You don't just get on here and do these things and suddenly you're rich at the top. Right? There's a lot of hard work in between. When you talked about these games that seem so simple now and these IP that seem so simple now, what you're seeing is a very, very well refined marketing machine. And that's probably the one missing part here, right? Is you can create a great product, but it needs to find an audience. And you can, if you've done all the work right, you've identified your audience, you know what sort of games they are playing, you know what sort of personas they have. But how do you actually find them? And that's the hard part, right? That marketing angle. And over time you get really good at figuring out what parts of your brand are really resonating with people and which parts aren't, and you start to refine it. We create a game with a company in Canada called Yukon, and the game's called Ava's Manor. And it was really interesting to see the journey of that IP as we figured out how to sell it, essentially, right? How you actually refine that marketing message that people understand very quickly what it is that the game is going to get them, what they're going to get from it, like what sort of story they're going to get and what sort of gameplay they're going to get. And, so when you look at the outliers in the space. You're seeing a very refined marketing message, but those early days would have been really scattershot. And it kind of comes back again to using data to cut through the noise, right? Like, what have we done? What did we learn? Like, what are we going to do now? Like, just keep that very, very simple in those early days. And, trying different sort of visual designs, trying different characters, seeing whether that really reinforces the story and the world that you're trying to create, or whether it's just one guy in our team likes to draw anime characters. Like, you want to have better reasons than it's just what we've got. Like, you got to have it's what the game wants, it's what the game needs. So yeah, but when it's working, you're right. It feels like everything makes sense, and that's the sort of the feeling you're trying to capture, where everyone on the team can intuitively understand why something's in and why something's out of a design or a visual identity or whatever, because there's a consistency and a strength to that theming that everyone can just fall in behind without having to sort of keep going back and going, but why this? But why that? Yeah, it's hard because when it's working, you can see it and it's great. But how do you capture that lightning in a bottle? It's a little bit tricky, right? But I like to follow. I always take it back to basics. You want to iterate. You want to always be thinking, what's the next thing I need to learn about my game? What's the next thing I want to discover? And then taking a step forward, doing that thing, measuring it, like actually go out and say, well, did it work or did it not work? I used to find, like, I'm a programmer back in the day. I'd be walking through the studio and I'd see two programmers arguing about the best way to implement a particular system. And I'd say, don't argue, just do both, and we'll pick the one that works. And oftentimes, once you start doing it, you go, oh shit, that's not going to work. We'll just do your one. And it's about cutting through the noise, getting away from the talk, because everyone will talk, biasing towards action, making measurable improvements to your game, and checking those assumptions against your audience, right? Like, who's going to buy this? Do they like this? Get them involved early. And that's hard because oftentimes you feel very protective of your brands at the start, right? But and you think, oh, if we show it to them now, then they'll, that sort of sets a line in the sand. But really, you can just, sand is great. You can just mush it up and then just draw another line. So, like, don't be afraid to get out early and yeah, get feedback from outside your studio, get outside the walls. You've probably heard people say that before, and get real people playing your game and going, this is cool, this is not cool. Whether you action it or not, or whether you just refine what you've got, but always back up your assumptions with actual data.
Yeah. Philip, I love it. Thank you so much for your insights, and hopefully instilling some confidence in people in the Southern Hemisphere to take these risks in a logical way, to give them the best chance to develop new IP. And so anyone who's interested in following Philip, you can find him on Twitter at PJM. Follow Mighty Kingdom and the games that they're developing and the IP that they're using, and see how they're doing it. Thank you again for your time and coming on to have a chat. I'm going to throw it back to Josh, and we'll do a Q&A and see if there's any questions for us.
Yeah. Just before we do actually Q&A, I'll actually go into a bit of a break and set us up for announcements, and then we'll go straight into Q&A. Hi everyone, just a little bit of announcements from my end for the Auckland Game Dev Meetup. First bit of announcements is Auckland Armageddon. Because of level 3 and restrictions, Auckland Armageddon Expo decided to move the expo from its original run date, which is Labor Weekend, October 24th to 26th, to now the following month in November, which is November 26th to 28th. It's an ASB Showgrounds. And if you actually have a game that you want to showcase for the event, you can do so via the forum here. It's a great opportunity to show your game, get awesome feedback, and meet new people. Please note, if you actually do want to showcase your game for the event, you need to be fully vaccinated before attending Armageddon Auckland. You can book yours today via the link below. And yeah, so a couple more announcements from the NZGDA. The NZGDA is having their board elections this October 18th. Nominations start this October 18th and will run until the first week of November. And it'll all culminate in the NZGDA annual general meeting, which is happening November 24th. If you have any questions or like to know more, please check nzgda.com for more info. And one thing I stumbled upon on when I was browsing through Facebook, there's an interesting 3D artist role happening at the moment through 3D Revolutions. This is an interesting junior and intern role. You need to have a strong knowledge of 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, V-Ray, Corona, and Photoshop. Strong attention to detail and image composition, modeling, lighting, and texturing, and has an eager to learn and improve. If you're someone that likes to use a certain piece of software that's free, Blender, you can apply. You can start applying via the link below. And a little bit about the next meetup, which is a fireside chat about the metaverse. This will involve James Everett, who is the co-founder of Exile, as well as Sam Ramloo, founder and managing director of Method Studio and M-Theory. And this will be the first virtual meetup where it's actually using a platform that's never before seen. And with that, back to our Q&A.
I think that's it's interesting, right? For me, I look at it, it's just a collection of technologies. And in essence, it's just like another platform. It's just another way to tell stories.
So, are we live now, Josh?
Yeah, we're live now, yeah. We're done with the Q&A, so... Yeah, and just actually in time, because I actually was announcing like the metaverse on like the very last slide for the next meetup happening in November.
There you go.
So, yeah.
It's a good plug. Yeah.
It's a good plug-in, yeah.
So are there any questions?
Yeah, so far there's not that many questions at the moment. So actually there's one. Just one very specific question, and the platform we're going to be using for the November meetup, which is it going to be like the VR world using BSV chain? Not actually. It's actually using something with Unreal Engine's MetaHuman system, so that's not really what it's currently using on. Yeah. Actually, I do have a few questions lined up on my end. And one interesting thing is, actually, I was reading a Twitter thread not too long ago about someone that's wanting their IP to be partnered with a publisher. And the interesting thing was that some publishers go for people who are passionate about their idea rather than having to go for the idea that's actually fought on the long term. So I'm actually curious on what are your 2 cents on that? Would someone want to partner with someone that goes for the passion and might burn out quick, or is it actually much more better just go for the long-term one?
Yeah, it's interesting. The publishing market has shifted a lot in the last little while as well. Much like a lot of the industry has changed, right? When I got into the industry, it was dominated by several big players. The big platforms had a lot of power and dictated a lot of what got in and it did or didn't happen on consoles. Now there's like a lot of publishers that offer a whole bunch of different options for studios to partner with. Traditionally, publishers would like to own your IP as part of the publishing your game. That was a pretty standard clause, and you'd get paid to develop your game and maybe a little bit of funds, a little bit of something at the end if you're lucky. But yeah, you basically signed away the rights to your IP, to your sequel rights, everything, right? It would all go away. The people who succeeded in that went out, like the developers who lost out in that ended up going out and creating publishers that don't do that, right? So you've got a lot more balance in the market now, where there are publishers that are far more developer friendly. You look at Kowloon Knights and their model. You can look at Team 17 and how they work with developers as well. There are a lot more out there that are far more friendly or developer friendly, because they realize that, like you say, it's not worth burning out that creator on a game, because what you really want to do is build a relationship with that creator, keeps coming back to you again and again and again. And we're seeing more recently contracts that have no like sequel rights or anything in them, when there's absolutely no incentive for you to there's no sort of requirement for you to go back to the same publisher again. And that's deliberately so that the publisher has to be really good to you so that you want to go back, right? And I think that's a really interesting approach. So there's developers have more power now than they've ever had before. The one thing I'd say is the further you can develop your idea, the better deal you're going to get, essentially, because it all comes back to my old friend risk, which is if the publisher is risking all the funds, then they want to take all the return. That's essentially how it works, right? And if you can develop a product, far enough along so that you've essentially kind of de-risked it, you've done the work, and you can show that there's an audience for this product, and that it's got all these, this great work that you've done, then you'll get a better deal because there's less that the publisher needs to cover, and less risk that they need to take. So yeah, definitely kind of gets back to that question about marketing, right? Make sure you kind of, the more boxes you can tick for them so that you go, oh, this is really good, you guys have done all this work, then it makes that publishing deal a lot better for you. But I'm a massive fan of work-life balance. We do a 4-day work week here. We only do Tuesdays to Fridays, and I would steer clear of anyone who's demanding that you work ridiculous hours or put in anything over and above, well, I'd say 30, but like a 40-hour work week, because it's often not worth it, right? Like any short-term gain you get in terms of productivity and whatnot falls away in the long term, and your product gets worse for it, and your mental health will get worse, and your life will get worse, and your relationships will get worse. So just don't do it. It's a lesson that's really hard to learn when you're young and you're really into it. Like my first job in the game industry, I was doing like 15-hour days, which was insane, right? And it was like 2 weeks into the industry. That company doesn't exist anymore. So to give you an idea of how sustainable that is. But yeah, I've definitely swung the exact opposite direction, right? It's not sustainable. It doesn't lead to a healthy and long-running business or a healthy and long-running industry. So yeah, don't let other people take advantage of your passion.
All right. Yeah. John Hamilton asks, does Mighty Kingdom only make games based on licensed IPs, or do you make custom IPs too?
Yeah, we do original product. We recently just listed on the stock exchange here in Australia, which was a whole other journey and a whole other hour-long discussion. But the reason we did that, the reason we raised that capital, is to invest in new IP. We've been around for 11 years, coming up to 12, and that journey for us started with doing work for hire. It's then evolved into doing licensing, and now it's moving into original product. If you think about the most successful game developers in the world, they would make original games. And that's what we want to be, so that's what we're going to do.
Okay. Yeah.
I have one question for Philip.
Yeah, keep them coming.
This is one thing. Do we have time, Josh?
Yeah, we do.
There's one question that we didn't get to in the main chat, but I know we could definitely spend a few minutes on it, and that was acquisitions and studios being acquired by bigger companies, publishers, brands, whatever they might be, and the kind of stigma against that. And I'd love to hear your opinion on what you think about companies being acquired and how you feel about that when you see that in the news.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's a little bit of a tall poppy syndrome, I think, comes up when we see those big numbers, and they're big numbers being pulled. Like, Ninja Kiwi was 187 mil. A44 was part of a $175 million deal. Those are big numbers, man. Those are huge numbers. And I don't even know what Grinding Gear got, but it was big enough to be announced, to be cleared by the foreign investment panel. So, look, that's amazing, right? That's an amazing result for those creators, and I'm sure it was a lot of hard graft for them to get there. I think it's a sign of a healthy economy. It's a sign of a healthy industry, like that people are looking in here and seeing this as a legitimate industry that, it can support investments at that scale. So I think that's exciting. The risk for me is that if it ends there, like what I would like to see and what I'd hope to see is that the people who do really, really well out of these acquisitions then become the investors in that next wave, right? That they help support the creators of tomorrow to create the next big businesses and next big exits, right? And you get that whole ecosystem going. You never want to end up in a spot where it's all just indie creators and nothing else, or all just AAA creators and nothing else. You want to have the whole pyramid there, right? You want to have everyone at every scale. That allows you if you're just if you're an employee, not just an employee, but they're the most important part of our industry. But if you're working in this industry, you want to have opportunity to work at studios of every scale that are relevant to where you are at your stage of your career, right? And we need successes. We need big companies. We need growth. We need those acquisitions to flesh out that whole industry, so that you've got those opportunities, right? Yeah, often I use an analogy of like a forest, right? You can't just have one big tall tree in the forest, because if that tree falls over, it just wipes out all the rest, right? You need to have everything at all the scales, so that if one falls, the others just spring up and fill that gap. That's the sign of a sort of a healthy and thriving ecosystem. So yeah, like it's I could never begrudge anyone else their success, right? We often just look at the outward facing parts of that the decision. Like you watch these companies from afar, and then you see these big numbers coming out, and you think, oh, those guys, But really, there's a lot of hard work to get a number that big out, to pull those acquisitions. There's a lot of value that they're creating, and you think about all the careers that they're supporting. You think about how that makes it easier for the next business to come along and convince an investor, right? Like, we don't have a particularly sophisticated investment community around the game industry here in Australia. I don't know what it's like in New Zealand, but it's really hard to convince people to give you money to make games. But the more successes we have, the more we can go, hey, did you see Ninja Q? You got $187 million. That's like, oh man, I'll have a piece of that. How much do you guys need? I'm going to put in. So that's what we see. That's what we need, right? And again, like investment and growth isn't for everyone. Like every business will be different, but we want to have every business of every type supported in this industry. So yeah, I find it really exciting.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of makes sense though, because it is kind of like the next step once you become like a massive IP though, right? So once you become big enough, you either get acquisition by another larger piece, or you become, or just continue
become the acquirer. Yeah.
Become the acquirer. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And look, there's some massive, like, I don't know if you, Embracer Group, they acquired like 22 companies in one day. There's just like madness out there at the moment, right? So it is a really great time to be in this industry if that's your path and that's your goal. So I think that is fascinating. You don't have to be acquired. You can. You look at Valve. They've managed to build a successful IP and now a successful platform. They don't have to go. No one can buy them, and they don't have to buy anyone. Like they're happy. But yeah, I mean, you look at Epic. Anytime anyone has any success on their platform, they just go and buy them. That's just how they go. But that's good. Like I say, as long as that is coming back into the industry in some way, then I'm all for it.
Yeah. But actually, one interesting question from Hani and Zed: would you see more acquisitions becoming more common in the coming years? I'm assuming it's either both NZ in Australia, or is it just NZ here? But yeah.
About acquisitions becoming more common?
Yeah.
It's a global trend. Like it's been happening in Europe a lot, and it's happened in the US a lot, and they're starting to tap out. There's fewer companies available to buy, so then they're like, okay, who else is out there? Oh my God, there's a whole Southern Hemisphere. Who even knew? And so they're looking. So you've seen a Big Ant here got acquired, Blowfish, A44 and Grinding Gear, and I mean the Rocketworks has got invested by Tencent, right? Like that's Ninja Q by MTG. There's just a lot. There's a lot happening in this space in the last year. I think when I totaled it up, I just did a talk at GCAP, it was over $400 million in investments and acquisitions in the last year. Wow. into Australia and New Zealand. That's humongous. Like no one, if you told someone there was $400 million invested into games, they'll be like, no. But it's happening. So yeah, like it's happening all around the world, and it will happen more and more. Like we've had a change here in Australia where we've got a new sort of federal support for the game industry. There's going to be a lot of studios turning up here, like the big AAA studios. They're going to look for people to work with, and we know that they'll just end up acquiring. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
And I think it's important to point out that it's across all platforms like mobile, PC.
Oh yes, sorry.
Like VR and AR probably a lot less, but there's a lot of investment still being pumped into those spaces, but probably not reflected in revenue. But it seems to be games as a whole across all the different platforms as well, which is cool to see.
I mean, if Netflix is acquiring game studios, then you know that there's like a crazy, like a consolidation happening, right? Like everyone's buying everyone. It's insane.
It is very interesting, yeah. There's not that many questions yet.
Yeah,
actually, just,
cool.
Yeah. It's a bit off topic though. What are your guys' thoughts on NFTs? Because I know like one of the more recent news, Untamed Isles has had like a massive Kickstarter campaign. I think they got about $800K in terms of investment. So, and their platform is like basically Pokemon open world, but also having NFTs as some form of currency. So then my question:
Am I gonna offend a whole bunch of people now?
Not really. I'm just like, I'm really like an open. Yeah. not
I'm
really
not-
close up conversation, but yeah.
It's funny, right? Because I'm like a technology skeptic, which is funny because I work in a space that's driven by technology, right? I tend to look and see how things settle over the long term. I feel like we're still in the hype phase of NFTs. So I'm still yet to be convinced about how they add value to consumers, right? Like, how do they make my life easier? When can I use an NFT to do a thing that is actually improves my life? Like, there's a lot of examples about how it could function or like use cases but it requires like significant behavioral change by a whole bunch of people that I like. For, the idea of, like, ask anybody who invested in CryptoKitties how they feel about their portfolio today, right? Like, there's a lot of like good news stories around the booms, but then it's all silence when it comes to the busts, right? And so it just feels a bit too hype for me. I like to just take a step back, wait for the dust to settle, and then we'll see where the best use cases come out for NFTs. I think the technology is fascinating. Like, I love the concept of it, but it just has all these like challenges, right? In terms of the energy cost and all these other things, like the way that it works doesn't function at scale very well, and the solutions to that create other issues. And so I'm like, okay, it's just too, it's just too wobbly at the moment. I need it to settle. When it comes to gaming, yeah, there are some success stories. A lot of people pull a lot of money. I think Animoca Brands, who do NFT stuff, got like $88 million worth of investment on the back of it, right? So there are some people putting a lot of money into it. I haven't quite seen the same amount coming back out the other way yet. Like, I haven't seen those companies pull those giant revenues that justify those valuations yet. So jury's still out for me.
Yeah, if I could add 2 cents to the conversation, I feel like it's a very interesting space, but it's very much the technologists figuring out the what can happen. It hasn't really impacted. Like, I don't see many game developers wanting to develop a game through blockchain technology. Like, game developers that have had a successful career in like traditional ways, wanting to jump ship yet. And I think it's an interesting like early stage now where there's a lot of experiments happening, but it's going to take some time before there's like a proven method for like the thing that the market accepts as a game that's built on blockchain.
We talked about VR. You mentioned VR just at the start, and they went through a similar sort of phase, right? Like,
Yeah.
there was, when it became possible again, the hype was insane, right? Like, literally every call I'd have, people would ask us if we're making a VR game. I'm like, no. Like, for us, it's like there wasn't enough of an audience for us to justify the investment, right? And that all kind of changed. Beat Saber selling 1 million copies is like, oh, okay, you can sell 1 million copies in VR. that's now it's a platform, right? So it's maturing now, and it's getting to a spot where best practices are emerging. We know what works, we know what doesn't. We know what type of people have VR. We know what games they play. So you can start to really cater to that audience, and it starts to find its groove. But yeah, NFTs, I'm not there yet.
Yeah, I guess we have 1 more minute for Q&A. I'd actually just like to close on this. So, if acquisitions become more globalized, since the Western market is now looking towards the Southern and Asian hemisphere, how would you see the game ecosystem turn into once that becomes more globalized and everyone basically knows everyone by that stage?
I mean, the industry is small enough, everyone knows everyone anyway. But look, I can tell you what my fear is. Like, we saw it here in Australia prior to the GFC, right? There was a lot of big studios represented here. We became a country that was focused on providing cheaper outsourced labor to big US studios. And there were a few independents, but they were really doing license work. Like, that's where I worked on Star Wars. I worked at Chrome on Star Wars. They were doing license work for overseas brands, essentially. And when the GFC hit and they started closing studios, there was no independent developer scene. There was no original IP that we could fall back on. So when those big trees started to fall, they just wiped out the whole industry. So my fear is that the consolidation happens, that these big overseas studios come in and acquire studios in New Zealand and Australia, and we all start creating content for them. And then in 20 years' time or whatever, when the next sort of pandemic or whatever comes along, and they all turtle up and they close all their outlying studios, we end up with nothing, right? And I want to, that's my fear. It's like, what I want to see is that studios get acquired. Those founders of those studios who do well out of those acquisitions, exit those companies, start new companies, or invest in new companies that create original content and create companies that are doing AAA product, but are owned wholly in Australia or in New Zealand, right? And so that all the benefits that flow from the IP and the success of IP comes back into our economy, and that doesn't sort of disappear off into the Isle of Man or the Bahamas or wherever they go these days. We want to make sure that all the value that we create is captured and returned to New Zealand and Australia. It's kind of why we went down this path of an IPO, to really stake a claim in being here in Australia and not looking to up sticks and sell somewhere else. But that's a very particular path, and I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it to everyone. But that concept of just being like, so Supercell does this really well. Supercell are Finnish. They are based in Finland. They pay all their taxes, and they have a lot of taxes over in Finland, right? But they do it very proudly, and it's all public there. So they publicly share how much that they're returning to that economy, because they're like, Finland gave us so much to get us here. We want to give back to it, and that's what I would love to see in this wave of acquisition and success, that we are coming back in and feeding back into the ecosystem, seeding that next wave of business, and growing the whole overall industry over time. Like I did a talk recently where I talked about how large the industry should be if we had the same number of developers per capita as our peers, like Canada, US, Finland, Sweden, others. Per capita, the New Zealand industry is 3 times larger than the Australian one, which is interesting.
Wow.
And so, for us in Australia, that would mean creating 10,000 more jobs to be able to catch up to where we should be, right? It should be in this instance. New Zealand is not quite so far behind, but it's still like, there's a lot more that we could be doing. This industry could be so much bigger and could support so many more people. And that means, like we talked about earlier, about allowing more people to make games, right? Like getting people who look different and sound different and think different into the room to make into this industry, so they can make games that only they can make, and really expanding the possibilities of what this industry could be. So like, if the acquisitions and the exits come with that as the outcome, I'm all for it. If it's just becoming a cheap outsource for companies overseas, no, I'm not there. So let's make sure that our government and everyone is looking at ways. There's things that governments can do, and if you're thinking about how to agitate your local government, oftentimes they talk about the headlines, things like the 30% rebates and whatnot, right? That's great, and it works great at scale. Like, it'll work great for Rocketworks, right? Like, the bigger your company gets, the bigger that check that the government cashes for you. But you can't just do top down. You have to do bottom up. You need to have support for people who are thinking about getting started in this industry. There can be things that government can do in terms of match funding. Like, if I go and raise $100,000, how about you give me $100,000 from the government? So you kind of double up. You can go further and you can do more. It lowers the bar in terms of that risk for investment, and multiplies those successes, right? But also through grants and through funding, like making sure that people who want to get a start in this industry and may not know how, that they've got access to mentoring and traineeships and things that can, like, there's all these things that can be done to help make sure that bottom layer is robust and that the companies are growing up from there. And it's not just all about bringing in the big guys from overseas. You trickle down doesn't work. we all know this now, right? So you got to plant those seeds. You got to take a very broad based approach, and you got to plant a lot of seeds to grow a lot of trees. That's what I'm about.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, well said. Yeah, that's all the time we have for Q&A, and just checking one last time on Twitch. Yeah, not that much left, but yeah. Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you, Carl, for hosting the live version of Zero to Play. But yeah, thank you all so much for tuning into this Auckland Game Dev Meetup, and hope to see you in the next one.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
See you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.